This is the Convict Australia podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Since June 1812, a war had raged between two great powers, the United States and Great Britain. The United States had declared war for three main reasons. Number one, the British economic blockade of France. Number two, the British were disrupting American trading vessels and kidnapping their seamen, forcing them to join their navy. It also disrupted their plans of expanding their territories to the west and north into Canada. And finally, number three, the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Like all wars, it was brutal. The British had succeeded in storming Washington and setting fire to the White House, or the Presidential Manor as it was known then. Thankfully, the stonework survived the fire, and evidence of where the fire licked the walls is still visible, but the original beautiful wooden and glass ceiling was destroyed. The President and his wife had earlier escaped, taking with them as many priceless artefacts as they could. The White House wasn't the only building to be set on fire. So too were buildings, houses, and departments of state, treasury, and war. Then they raised the flag of the Union Jack, leaving the city in ruins and engulfed in flames. It was a devastating time for Americans. People living in the city must have been in abject terror, seeing their city burning down amongst them, the military having fled and not knowing where or what had become of their president. The British did not remain in Washington. They kept moving and the war continued. Months later, in 1814, as war continued to rage, Captain William Harrison was readying his ship, the Francis and Eliza, for its journey across the seas to New Holland. On a bitterly cold day, on the 5th of December, he embarked on his journey from Cork with 54 male convicts and 69 female convicts on board. Along with the crew, they also had several free passengers with plans of making a fresh start in the fledgling colony. They sailed in convoy with another ship transporting convicts to New Holland, the Canada. The Francis and Eliza was an old, dependable two-decker vessel of about 345 tons that had 4 mounted guns. She had served Great Britain well in the Napoleonic years, ferrying troops around. Not long into their voyage, the two ships hit a storm and were forced to leave each other's side. The Francis and Eliza now sailed through the North Atlantic Ocean, down past the coast of France, Spain, and Portugal. On the 4th of January, almost a month into the trip, they were nearing the coast of Madeira, a small island off the coast of West Africa, when they were spotted by the American privateer, the Warrior. Not being prepared for battle, the ship was easily overcome. The men seized Captain Harrison, forcing him onto their ship while they plundered the Francis and Eliza. Captain Harrison anxiously waited hours before being led back onto his ship to face the devastation caused by the Americans. The ship had been stripped of its arms and what little ammunition it had carried. Each cabin had been ransacked, and to add further humiliation, the captain and the other well-dressed men on board were robbed of their clothing. To his horror, he discovered that the convicts had been released from their irons and witnessed the excitement and relief on the faces of the convicts as the irons were tossed overboard. Some of his crew refused to go back onto the Francis and Eliza, choosing to stay with the Warrior. The Americans sailed away, leaving the Francis and Eliza bobbing in the huge expanse of the North Atlantic Ocean, with a skeleton crew and over 100 unfettered convicts. It wasn't until they were out of sight of the Warrior that the full impact of their thievery could be ascertained. They had taken virtually everything they needed to sail to New Holland with. Along with the ship's papers, They had taken their provisions, charts, stores, and even their rigging. They had also taken a great deal of personal belongings of the captains and stolen expensive medical equipment and surgical instruments belonging to the ship's surgeon. What neither party realised was that Great Britain and America had signed a treaty of peace. The war was over. When the Warrior made it back to the States and heard that they were in breach of the treaty, they denied plundering the ship, stating that the captain of the Warrior had assisted their captain in maintaining order and left them with, quote, a bountiful supply of everything, proper for a 3 months' voyage, end quote. Want to hear more great stories about convicts? Then grab a copy of Convict Sydney, the real-life stories of 32 prisoners. From Elizabeth Sullivan, who was known about town as the fighting hen of Cook's River, with her flamboyant dress and tough countenance, to Robert Sidaway, who entertained local residents by hosting dramatic performances in his theatre. These colourful characters and their individual experiences offer a broader insight into the daily happenings of Sydney and the convict system. To get your copy, just click on the link in the show notes. With the ship in disarray, the remaining seamen took this as an opportunity to raid the liquor that was left and proceeded to get drunk and riotous. They were so out of control that they even set fire to the ship numerous times. Captain Harrison feared that the unruly seamen would team up with the convicts and there would be a mutinous revolt. But, much to his surprise, the convicts stepped up and assisted him in sailing the ship to Santa Cruz. The prisoners organised themselves into watches, taking directions and carrying them through so the vessel could continue on its journey. 6 days later, on the 10th of January, the depleted ship limped into Tenerife. The weary Captain Harrison was relieved to have made it. Under the orders of Mr. Duplex, the chief consul, the vessel was put into a 10-day quarantine. As soon as his feet hit solid ground, Captain Harrison immediately sought out the British man of war, who took the chief mate and 4 seamen that had caused all the trouble. They were going to be sent back to England for recriminations. The captain managed to get a few seamen at Santa Cruz to join his ship under verbal contract, as he had no ship papers to show. The Canada had also sailed into Tenerife, but had managed to avoid the American ships. Their voyage had been peaceful and uneventful compared with the Francis and Eliza. When both vessels had been prepared and restocked, they sailed in convoy once more, but this time they were escorted by the British frigate HMS Ulysses as far as Senegal. The captain of HMS Ulysses had also arranged for a military guard to come on board the Francis and Eliza at Sierra Leone. The military guard was drawn from the Royal African Corps and was the only time the Royal Africans helped guard a convict ship. When they arrived at Sierra Leone, they discovered that a dreadful fever was circulating the settlement. They learned that not long before their arrival, the wilding had arrived there, and the contagion had been so rampant that it had taken the life of its ship's master, Captain Gibson, and most of its crew. It was alarming to them that in such a small settlement, at least one funeral was performed per day. The Royal African Corps that was stationed at Sierra Leone had been so decimated by the contagion that only one man was able to carry out duties. Had their ship not been ransacked of all its medicine and medical equipment, they may have been able to come to some assistance, but alas, they left the settlement as swiftly as they could. Their next port of call was the Cape of Good Hope. The 2 ships pulled into the harbour on the 12th of May 1815. It had now been 148 days since they had left Cork. They spent 3 weeks at the Cape, where they would have delighted in resting their sea legs on solid land, eating fresh fruit and vegetables, and not having to bunker down in the small confines of the ship. The rest of the journey was uneventful compared to what they had already gone through. They left the Cape of Good Hope with the Canada by their side, but the two ships parted ways, with both arriving at Port Jackson 3 days apart. All up, the Francis and Eliza had taken 243 days to travel from Cork to Port Jackson. Not only had the convicts on board survived a mammoth journey to the other side of the world, but they had also survived fierce storms, the capturing by the Americans, the crew rioting and setting fire to the ship, and a raging, highly contagious and deadly epidemic. They must have felt relieved to embark at their final destination. Once in Port Jackson, some of the convicts were transported by cart to the districts of Windsor and Liverpool, with the women being sent to the Parramatta Female Factory. And that concludes the story of the Francis and Eliza. I hope you've enjoyed it. I can't imagine how fearful they would have been for their lives when the Americans captured the ship, particularly the women. I mean, they must have wondered what was going to happen to them. And I can only imagine their faces when the Americans let them out of their irons and tossed the irons overboard. That must have been an amazing moment. And I love that the convicts were able to surprise the captain. This would have been the perfect time for the convicts to revolt, and they didn't. They rolled up their sleeves and they helped the captain sail the ship. I hope that in some even small way the convicts were rewarded for this behaviour. Thank you for listening to the Convict Australia podcast. If you'd like to show your appreciation and get more involved, there are a number of ways you can. The first is by signing up to Convict Australia on Patreon, and you will get some perks like the Convict Australia Newsletter. Secondly, leave a review and tell your friends and family. This really does make a huge difference. And lastly, join the Facebook and Instagram group Convict Australia. All the links I've mentioned will be in the show notes. Thank you again. Till next time.